Something just broke inside Russia's parliament that the Kremlin cannot contain. Not a leak, not a rumor, not a whispered conversation in some back corridor of power. This happened on the floor of Russia's own parliament, in front of cameras, with the entire government watching. And the man who said it knew exactly what he was doing. Revolution is coming. Those 3 words, spoken out loud inside the State Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament, have set off a chain reaction that reaches all the way to the top, because the man who said them is not some fringe activist or Western-backed dissident. He is Gennady Zyuganov, the veteran leader of Russia's Communist Party, one of the most prominent political figures in the country, a man who has survived decades inside Russian politics, a man who knows exactly where the lines are drawn and exactly how close he can get to them without crossing over, and he just walked right up to the edge. But here is what makes this moment different from every other warning that has come before it. Zyuganov did not just use the word revolution. He gave it a date. He gave it a blueprint. He reached back into the darkest chapter of Russian history and held it up like a mirror to the present. And what he showed the room was something that no one in that building could dismiss. He said, Russia is heading toward a repeat of 1917. Let that land for a moment. 1917 is not just a year in a history book for Russians. It is a wound. It is a warning. It is the event that every Russian leader since has spent their entire political life trying to ensure never happens again. The year the Russian Empire fell. The year a government that believed itself untouchable was swept away by its own people. The year that everything the ruling class had built was torn apart from the inside out. And Zyuganov looked at Russia in 2025 and said, it is happening again. The room did not erupt. It did not have to, because everyone sitting in that chamber already knew he was not wrong. To understand why those words carry so much weight, you have to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface of Russia right now, because the picture that the Kremlin projects to the outside world and the reality that ordinary Russians are living every single day are 2 completely different things. Start with the economy. For a brief period, Russia's wartime economy appeared to hold. In 2023 and 2024, military spending pumped money into the system, and GDP growth reached 3%. Putin pointed to those numbers as proof that Russia was not just surviving Western sanctions, but thriving under them. His officials repeated the message, state media amplified it, and for a moment, some people almost believed it. Then 2025 arrived. GDP growth collapsed to barely 1%. Projections for 2026 were revised down to 0, 8% before a temporary oil windfall pushed the forecast to a still deeply troubling 1%. The wartime sugar rush was over, and what was left underneath was not a strong economy that had weathered a storm. It was a hollowed-out structure held together with debt, declining reserves, and the sheer momentum of a government too proud to admit what it had done. But the numbers alone do not tell the full story. The human cost does. Zyuganov stood in parliament and revealed a figure that should have stopped every conversation in the country. 600,000 Russians died last year. 600,000. Many of them, in Ukraine, sacrificed in a war that was promised to the Russian people as a short, surgical, and necessary operation. A war that was supposed to be over before anyone had time to mourn. Instead, it has become a wound that keeps tearing wider with every passing month, pulling more men from more families and more towns across a country that was told this would never happen. And this is exactly where Zyuganov's comparison to 1917 stops being rhetoric and becomes something far more serious. In 1917, the Russian Empire was collapsing under the weight of World War I. The war had killed hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. The economy was in freefall, supply chains had broken down, ordinary people were struggling to eat, while the ruling class continued to live in luxury behind walls of denial. The government did not see the end coming until it was already upon them. The ingredients were simple and they were deadly. A massive, grinding war that produced nothing but casualties, an economy breaking apart at the seams, a ruling class utterly disconnected from the suffering of its own people, and a population that had finally run out of patience. Look at Russia today and tell me which of those ingredients is missing. Zyuganov sees all of this, and what makes his warnings so significant is not just what he is saying, it is how he is saying it. He is not standing outside the Kremlin with a sign. He is not broadcasting from exile in London or Berlin. He is inside Russia's parliament, speaking in the language of loyalty, carefully framing every devastating criticism as a form of support. We are doing everything we can to support Putin and his strategy and policies, he told the chamber, but you, the government, are not listening. Read that again. Putin is the government. There is no separation between the two. When Zyuganov says the government is not listening, he is saying Putin is not listening. When he says the government's policies are driving Russia toward collapse, he is saying Putin's policies are driving Russia toward collapse. The framing is protective. The message is surgical. And then he dropped the sharpest line of all. If you, the government, do not urgently adopt financial, economic, and other measures, by autumn, a repeat of what happened in 1917 awaits us. By autumn. He gave a timeline. He is not speaking in vague historical metaphors. He is telling the Russian government that they have months, not years, before the pressure building inside this country reaches a breaking point. But Zyuganov's parliament speech was not his only move. Days earlier, on April 10th, he made an even more direct appeal to the Russian people themselves. If the authorities do not give voters the opportunity to correct the situation with their ballot in September, he warned, they will doom the country to defeat. And then he laid out what he sees as Russia's only two paths forward: capitalism with war, or socialism with justice. The political framing is obvious, but strip that away and the message underneath is stark. Russia under Putin is not working. If change does not come, Russia loses in Ukraine and collapses at home. Those are the only two destinations at the end of this road. Now here is the part that makes all of this more than just political opposition noise. On the exact same day that Zyuganov delivered his explosive parliamentary speech, Putin walked into a room full of Russia's top economic officials and started scolding them. The economic contraction was unacceptable, Putin declared. Something needed to be done. His voice carried the weight of a man who believes himself to be the solution rather than the problem. And every single person in that room sat quietly and nodded because not one of them had the courage, or perhaps the desire to survive, to tell Putin the truth. The truth being that everything falling apart around them is a direct consequence of decisions made by the man doing the scolding. This is a pattern that historians of collapsing regimes know well. The leader becomes increasingly disconnected from reality. He surrounds himself with people who reflect back only what he wants to hear. He blames the machinery for failing without ever acknowledging that he is the one who broke it. And the gap between his version of events and what is actually happening grows wider every single week, until one day it becomes impossible to bridge. Putin's own words give the game away. Back in December 2025, as Russia's economic slowdown was becoming impossible to ignore, Putin described it as a price paid for maintaining the quality of the economy and macroeconomic indicators. He said those words with a straight face to a country experiencing hiring freezes, soaring debt, depleted reserves, and a workforce being steadily consumed by a war with no end in sight. What quality of the economy? What macroeconomic indicators? This is a country whose central bank had an interest rate of 21% as recently as May 2025. It has since dropped to 14%. 5% is part of a desperate attempt to stimulate borrowing and growth. But 14.5% is still an almost unthinkable number for a functioning economy. Every reduction in that rate carries the risk of triggering another wave of inflation that hits ordinary Russians the hardest. Putin's scolding of his officials changes nothing, because the structural problems at the heart of Russia's economy cannot be fixed by a stern lecture in a conference room. Look at what those structural problems actually look like on the ground. Russia's reserves, the financial cushion that allowed the government to prop up struggling businesses and paper over the damage from years of war spending, are gone. Russia's own economic development minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, said it plainly at a business conference in April. He did not soften it. He did not dress it up in optimistic language. He told the room that the reserves had largely been used up and that the macroeconomic situation is substantially more difficult than before. That is Putin's minister, not an opposition figure. Not a Western think tank, a man who serves inside Putin's government, standing in front of a room full of business leaders and telling them the safety net has disappeared. And without that safety net, Russian businesses are making the only rational decision available to them. They are stopping growth. A survey by Russia's central bank found that 64% of companies do not plan to change their staff numbers in 2026. Mass recruitment has fallen off entirely. 14% of Russian companies are planning layoffs. The jobs that were supposed to absorb Russia's workforce are evaporating at exactly the moment when more and more Russians are returning from the front, damaged, depleted, and unemployable in the conventional sense. There is a grim logic to what comes next. Fewer jobs means more economic desperation. More economic desperation means more men who have no other option but to sign military contracts. The war machine feeds on the economic collapse it created, and the cycle tightens. Meanwhile, Russia's debt picture has reached a level that should alarm anyone paying attention. External debt has hit almost $62 billion, a 20-year high. The last time Russia's external debt exceeded $60 billion was January 2006. Combined state and private external debt adds up to $319, $8 billion, a 10. A 4% increase in 2025 alone. Putin has publicly claimed that Russia's state debt as a share of GDP is one of the lowest in the world. But when the reserves are gone, when growth has stalled, when revenues are declining, the ratio becomes almost irrelevant. Debt on a sinking ship is still debt on a sinking ship. The oil windfall that Putin hoped would save him is already beginning to unravel. The war in Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz created a spike in global oil prices that briefly gave Russia a financial lifeline. Reports indicated that Russia was pulling in an extra $150 million per day in oil revenues during March. Russian oil, which had been trading at around $40 per barrel under the weight of Western sanctions, climbed back toward the $59 per barrel target that the Kremlin had built into its 2026 budget. For a brief moment, it looked like the chaos in the Middle East might buy Putin the time he desperately needed. Then Ukraine moved. Ukraine began systematically targeting Russian oil infrastructure and export capacity in a campaign designed specifically to neutralize the windfall before Russia could bank it. In March alone, Russia's crude oil exports declined by 300,000 barrels per day. Refined oil product sales dropped by another 200,000. The extra revenue that was supposed to paper over Russia's economic cracks started disappearing faster than it arrived. The Band-Aid came unstuck, and now the wound underneath is fully visible. Hiring freezes, depleted reserves, record debt, collapsing oil revenues, hundreds of thousands dead, a war with no exit. A government scolding itself in closed rooms while refusing to acknowledge the source of the damage. This is what Zyuganov put under the microscope in Parliament. This is what he held up against the history of 1917 and said, look at how familiar this is. And now the most dangerous number of all. Putin's approval rating has dropped for 7 consecutive weeks. As of the most recent polling by the Russian Public Opinion Research Center, Putin's approval stands at 65, 6%. At the start of March, it was 73, 3%. In the space of weeks, nearly 8 percentage points have evaporated. And these are now his lowest approval ratings recorded since the beginning of the Ukraine invasion more than 4 years ago. Now factor in the context. This is Russia. This is a country where criticizing the president publicly has resulted in imprisonment, where people have been detained for holding blank pieces of paper at protest sites, where the apparatus of state surveillance monitors online activity, and where a single social media post can result in a knock on the door at 3 in the morning. In that environment, the fact that millions of Russians are willing to register disapproval in a poll tells you something profound. The fear is loosening its grip. The patriotic fervor that Putin weaponized when he launched the invasion has exhausted itself, and more people every week are finding the courage to say, even in a small and private way, that they no longer approve. But how many more are still lying? How many Russians say they support Putin not because they mean it, but because they know better than to say anything else? The real number behind that 65. 6% is almost certainly far darker for Putin than the figure itself suggests. And that gap between the official number and the true feeling inside Russia is exactly the kind of gap that in 1917 became the space where a revolution grew. Zyuganov made one more warning that has not received nearly enough attention. Back in March, before his explosive parliament speeches, the Communist Party leader looked at America's actions in Venezuela and Iran and drew a line directly to Russia. We will be next, he said. Look at Trump's strategy. China is first, we are second, Iran is third. He told the lower house of the State Duma that if Russia continues down this path, it will be torn apart worse than Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya combined. Russia is the planet's main storehouse of natural resources, and a weakened, debt-ridden, war-exhausted Russia sitting on top of those resources is precisely the kind of target that history says does not stay untouched for long. This is the ultimate endgame that Zyuganov is sketching, not just internal collapse, not just revolution, the possibility that a Russia broken by its own leadership becomes something that external powers can reshape entirely, that the war Putin started to expand Russia's territory ends up costing Russia far more than anything it ever gained. It is an almost unthinkable outcome for a country that under Putin defined itself by power, projection, and the fierce protection of its sovereignty. But unthinkable outcomes have a way of arriving quietly, built from 1,000 small failures, until one day they are simply standing at the door. This is where Russia is right now, a veteran opposition leader standing in parliament and invoking revolution, a finance minister confirming the reserves are gone, a business sector freezing hiring and preparing layoffs, a death toll of 600,000 in a single year, an approval rating in free fall for 7 consecutive weeks, a leader scolding officials for a crisis he personally created, and an oil windfall dissolving under Ukrainian drones before it can patch even the most visible cracks. Zyuganov is not a revolutionary himself. He is a political survivor who knows how to read the weather better than almost anyone else still standing in Russian politics. And what he is reading right now is a storm building on a scale that Russia has not seen since the last time its government thought it was too powerful to fall. Putin has spent his entire career making sure the word revolution never applied to him. He has jailed opponents, silenced critics, controlled media, manipulated elections, and built an apparatus of fear that was supposed to make the very idea of revolution impossible inside Russia. But fear only works until it stops working. Poverty is a more powerful motivator than fear. Grief is a more powerful motivator than fear. 100,000 families who have buried someone and received nothing in return are a more powerful force than any security apparatus. The ingredients Zyuganov described are all present. The conditions he compared to 1917 are not metaphors. They are measurements. And the timeline he gave was not vague. He said autumn. Putin knows this. Somewhere behind the stage press conferences and the carefully controlled image and the aides who tell him only what he wants to hear, Putin knows that what Zyuganov said in Parliament was not an attack. It was a diagnosis. And the diagnosis is serious. The revolution Zyuganov is describing has not arrived. But it does not need to arrive fully formed to change everything. It only needs to grow large enough that the government can no longer pretend it does not exist. And that moment, based on everything that is happening inside Russia right now, may be closer than anyone in the Kremlin is willing to admit. The clock is running. The cracks are spreading. And for the first time in years, someone inside Russia's own parliament has said out loud what many have been thinking in silence. What happens next may determine not just Putin's future. It may determine Russia's.